Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm here this morning with the lovely Charlotte. Charlotte is going to explain a little bit about what she does, and this morning we're going to have a chat about kind of cyber stalking, harassment. Charlotte is very, very, very knowledgeable in this area, and over to you.
Hi, my name's Charlotte. I am the helpline manager at the Cyber Helpline. So we are a charity that started around 6 years ago now to support victims of cybercrime and online harm. And around 50% of our cases involve an element of cyber stalking or harassment, often by an ex-partner. And a lot of what we do is supporting individuals through linking them up with cybersecurity professionals who can help them to navigate their issue, report to the police, and secure their accounts and devices.
Yeah. Wow. So a lot then. There's quite a lot going on. And
yeah, absolutely.
That's because partly one of the things that really I think has become quite apparent in the last, I don't know how many years, but that we've had this sort of stigma about domestic abuse being something that, you know, just occurs in the home, only happens to certain people, whereas actually domestic abuse in itself is getting a lot more, you know, clever in terms of being able to use technology as another form of abuse. And in a lot of kind of support programs, that comes up now as something to discuss, you know, that kind of the cyber element, you know, if you're using social media, if your children are using apps on, you know, an iPad, something like that. And just for those who don't understand and don't really kind of, because there will be a lot of people who are actually experiencing domestic abuse and don't realize that this is, you know, an element of it. You think of stalking as being something as an in-person thing, you know, that person is literally following that other person. But actually now we're in technological times where stalking is on so many different levels. So would you explain a bit more about how sort of the different examples, if you like, of how cyber stalking occurs?
Yeah, so there's so many different ways, and it's not necessarily technical. I think that's the common misconception, is that cyber stalkers are super technical.
Yeah.
And the reality is that most of the time they're not. A lot of the time it will come from a previous relationship, and they may have gaslighted the survivor into believing that they are really technical, and the survivor themselves is absolutely not technical at all, and they don't know what they're doing. But actually what tends to happen is, over the course of a relationship, the perpetrator is setting up accounts for them, setting up devices for them, so they know their password, they have control over being able to see what's happening on those accounts and devices. And it's not necessarily spyware. I mean, I've been doing this for 6 years now. I've dealt with thousands of cases, and I've only ever seen spyware in 2 cases. And I think a lot of people, when you look online at cyber stalking, it's one of the most common things that comes up, is you probably got some sort of software on your device that's hidden, and the perpetrator can see everything you're doing on your phone, and can see all of your texts. And that's just generally not what tends to happen. It's things like hacking into your Apple ID or your Google account, where they are able to see who you've been texting through there, or it's knowing your Facebook password, or it's sending messages to you online, or sometimes it might even just be that your profile's not private, and they're able to look at your statuses and see your location and where you are at any one time. So it's basically just gathering intel from the information that's readily available to them, whether that is public information or information they have a password to get into, but also then using that to often harass and send messages as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's massive. And I think, you know, a lot of the time, I think victims and survivors feel that they can't use social media. You know, a lot of people I've spoken to over the years, and it's very much a case of, no, I don't do it because I'm trying to protect myself. But it isn't just, you know, social media is a big element of it, I would imagine, but it isn't just that, is it? It is so many other areas, like you say, being able to hack into your phone, to know who you're speaking to, know what your plans are that weekend, where you're going to be, you know, that sort of thing. So what kind of, you know, obviously, if, for example, if somebody thinks, well, I can't use social media, I can't do this, I can't do that, or I'll block them and that'll be the end of it. But then obviously, what would your advice be to those people who are saying, you know, I don't want to have to feel like I'm isolated? Because that's part of domestic abuse as well, is the isolation aspect, that perpetrators then ensure that they have complete control over the victim. So if you want to attempt to have a normal a life as possible, if you like, then what sort of advice would you give about how to stay safe online?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a big part of what we do, is speak to people about how you can regain that safety online and your online confidence. So things like, sometimes for people, having and starting your social media accounts afresh, more for your peace of mind than anything else, is a big part. And then with that new account, you can do things like use your first name and your middle name, or a way that's less easy to find you. Maybe you don't want to have a profile picture for a little while. Eventually we want to get somebody to that point where they can use social media how they want to use it, but sometimes it's just starting off slowly and using it in a way that's more anonymized to start with, and then building up to that point where you're using it how you want to use it. And I mean, when it comes to kind of blocking people, I think that's the most common sense advice that's commonly given. But actually, what tends to happen in cyber in general is that common sense often isn't the best way to go about things. So things like blocking somebody, you've got kind of two issues there. Firstly, it kind of can lead to a loss of evidence, and then if you were going to go to the place, you've lost that evidence where they've been messaging you, and you've lost intelligence where they continue to message you. But also with that, you may escalate the behavior. I mean, stalking by its nature is obsessive. So if you look at, for example, if you were to block somebody, they may then escalate to hacking your accounts at that point in order to see what you're doing, and they may escalate to the physical stalking. So it's kind of making sure that you're controlling what they can do, to the point where you might want to leave that access in place for a while, but make sure that you're seeking help to get to a point where you can eventually remove that, but just doing it when the time is right and it's safe to do so.
And it's all these kind of things, isn't it, that one of the reasons I started the podcast and I started the guest blogs and things is because people aren't aware. And as much as there is support and help out there, I think one of the biggest issues for a lot of people is if you don't know that you are experiencing abuse, whether it's cyber stalking, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, you know, a lot of the time, many aspects of it go hand in hand. It's not very often that you find one element of domestic abuse. It's usually the coercive control, like say before, the gaslighting. And I think that's what's really difficult is getting that message out there that actually, you know, it isn't normal that somebody is doing that, because unfortunately, when you have experienced domestic abuse or you are experiencing it, that is your normal. You know, well, they just care about me, they're just being protective. You know, that's the misconception there, that it's that they're protecting you, they're taking care of you, whereas actually what they're doing is completely controlling you and using that power and control to make sure that, you know, they are in control of your life. So it's really hard, isn't it, to get that message out there to say to those people who don't know they're going through domestic abuse, where to get that support and where to look for those. It's almost like the signs, isn't it? Like what signs to look for almost in a relationship. That's, I think, one of the most difficult things.
I think that's why technology is so common now in abuse, because technology is constantly changing. So there's always new ways to be able to monitor someone without them knowing, or even for things to pop up that seem a little bit strange, and for somebody to say, oh, don't worry, that's fine, don't worry about it. So you start to question your normality and what is normal versus what is malicious online, because there's things constantly changing. A really common thing that we see is advertisements on Facebook. So for example, if somebody sees an advertisement talking about, I don't know, as an example, wedding rings or engagement rings, and you've just been speaking about kind of marriage, you might feel that that's placed there by the perpetrator, but in reality Facebook, all the social media accounts are listening and will put stuff there. But for somebody that's already experiencing something malicious online, that does feel like it's something strange happening there. And then
very true.
Yeah, and it's so common, it makes so much sense. So a lot of what we do is actually explaining that and trying to navigate what is real versus what is malicious. And then I think also on top of that, it's a matter of with the technology, that a lot of what the perpetrators do is normalized now, especially in children. So things like, if you are tracking your partner's location on Find My, a lot of parents are doing that now with their children. Kind of seen as now that normalization of surveillance being love, which isn't the case. And actually you need to have those conversations with your children. If you are tracking them, I'm doing this for your safety, but if someone else does this to you, you need to think, what are their motives, what are their intentions? So a lot of what we're teaching our children is then happening in their relationships in adulthood, and they're just seeing that as normal behavior, so they're not seeing that as abuse.
Yeah, and I think, that's a really good point, because one of the things I often talk about with obviously various professionals is one of my biggest passions is how do we, for people of my age, mid 40s, you unfortunately, if you have got experienced domestic abuse, it is something that you are then going to have to manage the consequences of that for the rest of your life. And it was never something that was discussed when I was younger. It was never something that, it only happened to other people. It never happened in your family or in any relationship you would ever have. And I think getting that message out there to younger generations, and not even just, I'd done a podcast the other day with Rachel Lemon, and one of the things we would talk about is when children are sort of teenagers, getting to 15, 16, that kind of age, a lot of behavior is learned already. So when professionals do go into schools and talk to teenagers about, awareness in terms of cyber stalking, domestic abuse in general, for me, I think it needs to go further back than that, because 10-year-olds are, I've got a 10-year-old and she's more tech savvy than I am, and she can find a way around phones and everything else. And I think there's nothing wrong with having conversations at an earlier age with children and, children and young people, to say that being safe, and there is a lot that is out there in terms of being safe online and talking about it. I think it's how to explain that in a way that links in domestic abuse. And it's a tough one, because, you don't want to look like you're sort of linking the two together and that's it. It's always going to be like that. It's not. It's just in some situations, like you say, saying to your child, I'm doing this because I love you and I want to keep you safe, is one element. But if somebody else is doing it, how you explain that as power and control, it's difficult, isn't it? It's almost like re-educating society on on so many levels.
Yeah, exactly. And when kids are more tech savvy than their parents, that's when it comes a time that becomes quite hard and scary to do, because it's the kids that are showing their parents how to track them on their phone. And if you don't understand how technology works, how do you have that conversation with them about what abuse might look like, when they're the ones that understand what's going on? And I mean, even kids nowadays are looking up their partners on Facebook, and their boyfriends, girlfriends, their friends, their ex-partners, and looking them up and finding all this information on them. That is what we would amount to stalking behavior in adults, but to them it's quite innocent, and it's just what Facebook's there for. And actually what they're doing is really clever too, because that's what professionals do in kind of open source intelligence, what police are doing to look for criminals, and they've got a real skill set there. So having somebody who can have those conversations with children about what abuse looks like, but actually, if you're good at tech and you're doing you're using these behaviors, what are some sort of careers that you can get into? God knows that we need it.
Absolutely, because I think that's, like you're saying, so the Cyber Helpline, when was it launched? Did you say 10 years ago?
6 years ago.
6 years ago, yeah. And like you say, thousands of calls in that time, and people that you've helped and assisted and all the rest. I mean, it just shows, I think, just how important it is to have that support there. And because obviously what I do with my resources page now is make sure I have as many resources in as many areas of domestic abuse as possible. And obviously Cyber Helpline is on there. And just for people to be able to get in touch, if it's something like, for example, a lot of the time, being able to contact somebody directly if you're still living in the abusive situation is really difficult. And sometimes the advice might be go through a friend that you trust, and use their phone maybe to contact the helpline or look up the helpline and that kind of thing. What would your advice be on that? Because again, it's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we've always tried to find an answer to that is something different than speak to your friend. And the best we've kind of got there is we have a chat bot on our website. It's 24/7. You can use it anytime, and it's completely anonymous. And that is able to diagnose your issue and talk you through some steps that you can take. Then if you do need more help, it will put you through to our team of helpline responders. So if you aren't sure if your communications are safe, or if you know they're not safe, then unfortunately the advice is the same of see if you can use a friend's device, or even if you go to a library and you can use a public device is really good if you don't have somebody that you trust that you can speak to about it. In a lot of cases, people have a second phone that they're able to hide. Some cases that may not be safe to do, but if you feel like it's something safe that you can do and you can hide it safely, then, and you have the funds to get that, then that would be a really good idea as well. But ultimately the best way to start is kind of using either a public or a friend or family member's device, so that you can make sure that's safe. And I think it's best to do that even if you're not sure if your communications are safe, because the last thing you want is to escalate the issue just because you're seeking help.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, that is so true. And something that just came to my mind then, because again, going back to sort of elements of the perpetrator's power and control, coercive control is something we hear more and more about on a daily basis now, whether it's in the newspapers, whether it's online. And I think one of the really important factors for any victim or survivor, and even family friends, that are concerned, or work colleagues that are worried about, somebody they work with, or friends that are worried. I think a really important message is it is all anonymous. And that sounds like the most stupid statement that anybody could make. But I have had that experience where the perpetrator will say, no, I've phoned this helpline and they've never heard of you. I've spoken to this domestic abuse charity and they've never heard of you. And as a victim, your brain kind of goes straight back into that, oh, okay, well, they know better than I do, therefore this must be true. And even though you're a very sane, rational human being, unfortunately, the coercive control and that manipulation makes you think irrationally. So when it is important. I know it sounds like a really silly thing to say, but it is important to make it clear, isn't it, that anything that anybody contacts, say yourself about, or any support services, it is anonymous. They're not going to find out. That's a big thing that I think a lot of people overlook.
Totally. We would never tell somebody if somebody else has used our service, and it is completely anonymous. And we make sure that everyone knows of that, whether you contacted us because of fraud or because of cyber stalking or harassment or domestic abuse. We would never tell somebody else that you were using our service.
Absolutely. And because with a lot of services as well, sometimes there is a bit of a shelf life, as we know, because unfortunately funding, etc., it gets to a point, doesn't it, where you might be able to attend certain groups, for example, or so is it something that, if you feel, and again, this is a big one with victims and survivors, is a lot of the time they may feel like they've had that support. Okay, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like I'm moving forward now. And then all of a sudden, something will happen. All of a sudden, something will happen, and they're kind of back to square one. So it is something where they can contact you again, because I think that's what people are afraid of a lot of the time is, well, I've contacted them, I can't bother them again. I can't be ringing again, or I can't be emailing again, or pressing the chat button again. I'm going to look like a nuisance. And I think that's another element that a lot of people have experienced abuse. That's a side effect, unfortunately, of it, is you do feel like you're being a nuisance to people, and you're not.
No, absolutely not. And our support is completely uncapped. As long as we can still support you with the cyber elements of your issue, we will support you. Even if that's that you come back to us in a week's time or a year's time and say, I'm a little bit concerned about this. And it might even just be something that we've discussed already. So for example, something to do with the algorithms on Facebook showing you ads you're not sure of. So we can just offer that reassurance to you and say, this is how that works. And it's very unlikely that someone would be able to place that there. So even just for that reassurance piece, our support is completely uncapped, and we're able to support you no matter where you are in your journey. And I think you're so right. I think when people first come to us, they start trying to rush through everything and they want to get everything done all in one go with us. And we say, like, hang on, let's take this slowly. And I think when we ask that question of why do you want to get it done now, it's always, well, I know that other services dropped me after a few weeks, and we want to take things at everybody else's pace, so we will take our time with things. We're not going to secure every account and device all at the same time, because it's so draining to do that sort of thing, and also we want to do it slowly and make sure we're doing it right. So our service is completely uncapped.
That's amazing. And again, it is so important, because I think another element as well with domestic abuse is things change on a daily basis, because a lot of the time, once the perpetrator feels that they're no longer in control, this is where post-separation abuse comes in, which a lot of the time is the stalking element. And so they either shift it up a gear or they go down a different route, and things change so rapidly. And that's, I think, one thing that's really difficult to explain in general to society is, yes, it is something that is ever moving. Domestic abuse isn't something that stayed in one place for the last God knows how many centuries. It is something that will consistently move and evolve and develop, unfortunately, because perpetrators will find different ways, and there will be other ways in the future that I always say this, there'll be ways in the future we haven't even thought of yet, that they'll be able to keep that power and control, and it's just so important. I think that my biggest kind of message is that nobody should ever feel that they're that alone, that they've got nowhere to turn. You know, you can have family and friends around you and it's fantastic, but unfortunately they haven't experienced it. So more often than not, their support is limited by their own lack of understanding, and it's not their fault, it's just it hasn't happened to them. And you are the person that is going through it, and you are the person that at the end of the day, when you put your head on the pillow at night, it's you that has to get up the next day and deal with whatever repercussions are coming the following day. So knowing that there are support services out there that deal with every, you know, element that we know of at the moment in terms of domestic abuse, and being able to contact the likes of the Cyber Helpline is massive. It's huge, and knowing that it's safe to do so.
Yeah, I think that's a really big thing, is a lot of people come to us and say, well, nobody's ever seen this before, nobody understands what's happening, especially with the cyber stuff.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the chances are that we have. I think when it comes to cyber, especially, there's so many ways of making it look like it's really technical when it's really not. And even things like smart homes, and we've had a lot of cases where heatings have been turned on really high when the victim survivor leaves the house. So once they leave the house, they see on the Ring doorbell that they've left, they'll turn the heating up so that when they come back, the house is hot and they're paying a massive bill. So even things like that we're seeing almost every day now. And I think there's kind of no limits to if something's happened, we've probably seen it, and if we haven't, we can definitely find a solution for it, and figure out exactly what's going on, because a lot of the time that is the main thing, is, you know, something's happening but you're not exactly sure how. So for us, that's a big part of what we do, is investigating exactly how it's happening. So you might have Googled it and it's come up with spyware. The chances are it's not, but we'll help you look for that, and we'll help you look for what the actual reasoning might be.
That's amazing. And that's huge, isn't it? Because that's the where you feel that, you know, the biggest problem is not feeling safe. So knowing that you understand. And again, another huge aspect of domestic abuse is more often than not, no one's going to believe me. You know, it's so ridiculous that people are going to think I've made this up and I'm losing my marbles. And you're not, because I always say truth is stranger than fiction. And more often than not, you, like you say, you'll have seen it all probably, and there'll be nothing that surprises you, where somebody needs to feel that they're not, you know, looking daft by saying, well, I know I look like I'm being paranoid, but X, Y, and Z. You know, you're there to say, actually, you're not being paranoid at all. It's perfectly normal to feel that way. And actually, yes, it is happening, and you're not going mad. Because that's, again, something unfortunate that many victims and survivors feel, is that lack of believability. You know, people actually believe in them in the first place. And, you know, knowing that there are the likes of the Cyber Helpline out there to say, well, we do believe you, and we just want to help. You know, we are there to support you every step of the way. And like you say, the most important thing is to do it slowly and not to rush it, because once you're in that position where you want to start making changes in your life, like you say, most survivors and victims, they just want to get it done with, because they want to try to start moving forward. But unfortunately, it is part, and there'll be things that maybe they haven't thought of that you can talk through them and say, well, actually, and there'd be something that would have been missed if it hadn't have been done in a methodical sort of manner. Yeah.
Totally. So for example, we always want to do a phone first, but off our mobile network, and then do a Wi-Fi after, so that we can connect safely, because there might be that if the Wi-Fi is compromised, what's the point of securing all the other devices? They're just going to get hacked again through the Wi-Fi. It's very rare, but we just want to make sure that we do it in that sort of way to be on the safe side. So there's routes to go down. And also the other side of that is that we want to do it slowly to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So that if we secure something and the situation escalates, we need to hold it there and continue at a later time. So we don't want to do everything all in one go because of that either. And that's not to scare people, but to make sure that we're doing things as safely as possible.
Yeah.
Because that's the last thing we want, is that in trying to get safety, you end up making the issue escalate.
And a lot of the time, like you say, you know, this could be used as evidence. You know, this information is evidence potentially for criminal proceedings or whatever, that, you know, they need that information. So it needs to be as thorough as possible, because there's so many times that things are thrown out because there isn't enough evidence, you know, and it's a he said. That's one of the things, unfortunately, that crops up far too often, is it's a he said, she said scenario, which, you know, and we know it works both ways. We know it's women and men that are both abusers and and victims. Sorry, it could be either. You know, it's getting more and more common that there are male victims as well as female victims, and children and young people, that's on the rise. And I think you know, if we have the likes of the Cyber Helpline out there to help with things that, you know, I wouldn't have a clue, you know, what any device is, where I'm lucky that I can work Zoom, to be perfectly honest with you. That's about as far as I go. But yeah, and just because obviously I know you're exceedingly busy and taking your time up this morning, I'm really, really grateful. Is there anything you would say if you were going to give, because normally what I do is I ask a couple of questions and say, how do you think we can break down the barriers, and why do we think it's so difficult to talk about? But I think a more important question to you would be, what would be the one piece of advice you could give, if you could give it to somebody that thought, and maybe watching this thinks, actually, I think I'm going through this and I'm not really sure what to do next?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is to seek help before you do anything, because you, like I said, a lot of things with cyber seem like common sense, like blocking somebody or factory resetting your device to get rid of spyware, but actually you've removed evidence potentially, and you may have escalated the behavior. And we see that in so many cases, where even somebody might go into a police station and say, I think my phone's been hacked, what do I do? And the police will say, I'll just factory reset it. And the minute you've done that, you've lost all the evidence. And then people come to us and we have to try and dig that evidence back up, which isn't possible most of the time. So that would be my number one bit of advice, is seek help from the likes of myself, from domestic abuse or stalking charities, before you take any actions otherwise, because that's the first biggest step, and you want to make sure that what you're doing safely and that it is the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I love it. And as I always say, you know, the website is on the resources page, hopefully, potentially looking at the likes of the guest blogs, because they're another element that's important, because I'm always trying to make sure that everybody is kind of accounted for, if you like. Some people prefer to read and take that information in that way, or even be able to say, like I said before, maybe a family friend or family member or whoever, or work colleague wants to understand a bit more in terms of cyber stalking or any kind of abuse that goes on online, that the likes of the Cyber Helpline is there to offer that information as well, you know, so that for those who aren't going through it can get a bit more of an understanding of what it's all about. Yeah,
I will get to work on that, and I'm looking forward to sharing.
I'm excited. Yeah. Oh, well, I want to say thank you very, very much, because I know you're an exceedingly busy woman. And no, I'm really grateful for you taking the time this morning. Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.